Hello Middlebury novices / folks that are new to APTA. In this video I'm going to talk to you all about case writing, especially writing your first case. This is really interesting because case writing is one of the coolest parts of APTA, because you get to think about whatever you are passionate about or whatever you think is really interesting, and then you get to talk about that with smart people. So in this video I'm going to focus on what to do for the first time. And then also most of this applies also for the next time and the next time, and pretty much for anyone that's trying to write cases. So here's the biggest thing. If you take away only one thing from this video, the biggest thing would be that the only way to get better at writing cases is by writing cases. If you find that you're constantly like paralyzed with fear that you're going to do something wrong or your case is going to be terrible or whatever, it probably is. It's okay. It doesn't matter. The way that you get it to be less terrible in the future is by writing terrible cases now. And that can apply whether you're a novice or a junior or a senior. Whatever it is, writing more cases helps you get better at cases because you understand the inner workings of cases better, and it also makes you more observant when you're debating against other people. You can listen to their case and be like, you'll be more likely to notice when someone does something interesting in a case or something that you want to emulate if you've recently written a bunch of cases on your own. And so the process of case writing doesn't stop, or at least it shouldn't, if you want to keep getting better at it. And you should want to keep getting better at it, assuming that you want to debate or be a person that can make arguments, because being able to write cases well, even if you think that it's terrible and boring, will also help you become a better debater, because it'll help you think concretely about the structure that you want. So even if you do a format where you never have to write cases again, it's still a really good idea to write cases just as practice, because it's one, interesting, and two, it'll build a whole bunch of skills that are absolutely necessary. So the first thing I want to talk about is how to pick your topic. And the workshop that I run, or I don't know if it's a workshop, but sort of a one-on-one thing that I do with people when they're trying to write their first case, is I'll sit down with them and I'll say, what do you think is cool? What do you think is interesting? What do you like to read about and talk about in the news or in your life or in your classes? And then write those things down. So if I were you right now, what I would do is I would think about 5 things that I think are cool, whether they're classes or subjects or things that I've read about recently or things that I like to talk about or things that I like to read. Make a list of those things, 5 of them right now, and I'll explain why in a second. But if you're really good about this, then pause this video and write these things down or put them on a sticky note on your computer or whatever. Just find 5 of them, or more if you want, that you think are interesting, and then I'll talk about what to do with them in a second. So pause. All right. Now that you've paused the video and you've come back, or you haven't, you've just watched me look like an idiot, here's what you should do next. Now that you've got these things, or you have them in your brain, but they really should go on paper, then the next thing to do is think about what is happening, what kinds of stuff is interesting about those, or what things have you thought about or read about or talked about recently within those areas. So if you're really interested in in modern art, and someone just did a modern art installation where they, made the audience into the art piece, or I'm not an expert on modern art, but the idea is think about the things that you've thought about recently to give a little more detail to those big topic areas that you put. If you put history, put a time period in history or a person in history or a list of those people. So try to expand this list out of 5 things into 5 things that also each have 5 or 6 parts to them of different things that are interesting. Then the next step that you want to do is look at those things that you have. So now, if my math is right, you have between 25 and 30 different little things that you think are cool within some big discipline areas. So what you want to do with these is you want to think about which ones could be potentially controversial. So something that you think might be able to be debated about. So if you think, let's say it was that art installation where, let's say you take the participants that come into the gallery and then you hang them by their hands and then they are the art piece or whatever. But they didn't ask people ahead of time if that's something that they wanted to be strung by their hands. This is getting very strange, but just go with it. Then you could, the thing that is debatable would be is it acceptable to hang participants in an art gallery up by their hands without their consent? Maybe they consented to being in the art installation, but they didn't know exactly what was going to happen. Whatever. Think about whatever is interesting to you within those many kind of sub areas, and if it could be debated about. So if it's something that could be controversial, then write about it. But as a side note to what I just said, I wouldn't say most topics that involve do you need consent are a good thing. I would stray away from that area, at least for now. So think about things that could be controversial within that topic area. Or the other thing to think about would be if something is changing in that area. So if someone is proposing a new policy, or if a government just did a certain thing, or if a group of people are now protesting in a certain way, then you could write about that. That could be the case about whether or not people should be protesting in that way, or whether or not that government should have done that thing, or that person should have done that thing, or written that letter, or whatever. Because in APTA, when you're creating a case, you do want to make sure that you're not debating, you're not proposing something which is already status quo. You don't want to propose something that's already happening. So if the U.S. government is already providing Medicaid to people that don't have a lot of money, then your case probably shouldn't be the U.S. should provide Medicaid. It could be the U.S. should provide more Medicaid because that's a change, but you can't do something that's already status quo. So try to think about things that are changing in those areas or that you think could change, because you can also use your own ideas. If you think something should be done about a certain problem, then that can be your first case. Or if you just know of a topic area that's commonly debated, like whether it's people should have the right to get an abortion, or just Google debate topics. You can get a bunch of ideas. People should be vegetarian. All of these things are actual cases that people have written, and that you can write too, especially to start getting getting comfortable writing cases. It's definitely something that's very not a bad idea at all. Just Google debate motions, and you'll find a bazillion different things, and they might either inspire you to write a certain motion, or you might actually just want to use that exactly to write your first case. So think about that and start doing that with especially these topic areas, and thinking about which one of them, or two of them, or three of them might be the things that you want to start off with. So those are the ways that you can get your idea for the first your ideas for your first case. Other ways that you can keep generating case ideas after that include a few things. So one of them is just reading the news. So when you read the news a lot, or watch the news, I guess, if people still do that, or listen to it on the radio, whatever you do, you'll notice a lot of things are happening. Changes are happening all the time, or people are doing new and interesting things. And you can discuss whether those things are good or bad. Or you might just read about a problem. You'll be like, oh wow, there's this crisis of xenophobia in South Africa, of people from Zimbabwe being killed in really gruesome ways, as was happening last year more, and obviously still happens to some degree. So maybe you've noticed that problem, you've read an article about that, or how terrible it is, or some kind of poverty or malaria or whatever is happening in different parts of the world, or just other kinds of social issues. Then you can think about those and come up with a clever solution to change them. Or Google, how are people trying to fix this? Or Google articles about these different topics, and until you read something where you're like, that's a really clever idea. And not only is it clever, but it also could have negative consequences. So if it's something that's just probably a good idea, definitely, then maybe don't write a case about it. You can probably read elsewhere or talk to people about what a tight case is, but it's pretty much something that can't be argued against. So if your case is don't kill babies, that's probably not what you want to write, because it's difficult for the opposition team to argue against it. You do want to come up with cases that are fair-minded, in the sense that there is legitimate disagreement in the world, or there should be legitimate disagreement on these topics. So that's what you want to focus on, is things that are, as I said before, debatable. So read the news. In your classes, actually listen. And while you're listening, I would, in my notes, this also helped me to listen better in class, I would do, I had a symbol, so it was a triangle for me, and whenever I heard something interesting that a professor talked about that I wanted to research more or might write a case about, I would, at the top of my notes on that page, just write a triangle, and then write the thing. And then later, when I needed more case ideas, I would flip through my notes and be all right, triangle, 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 and then come up with some interesting ideas. And sometimes, those ideas end up being really good cases, even if they weren't something that, it's just something your professor said that you thought was interesting, about the regulations being put on this certain type of product, or the way that people are doing something, whatever it is. But think about what your professors are saying. Think about the stuff that you're reading in the news and in classes and for classes and all that stuff. Third one would be just like go online and like go on like, I don't know, Google News or think pieces or like Jezebel and think about and read different cool stuff. And then also I already mentioned looking at debate motions, but that's like Googling debate motions, but that's still a good idea. And then lastly, just in general, like think about if you could change one thing about the world, what would it be? And if your answer is like super generic, as mine probably is about like ending poverty or like end world hunger or whatever, or like create world peace, then that's cool. Like that's totally fine. But go deeper and go 1 or 2 or 3 levels of specificity down. So if you think like world peace is your thing, that's cool. Like I dig that also. Go and think about one particular area where peace would be awesome. Like the Middle East would probably be cool if there was peace there. So and then from that, think about the things that you would do to change that. So what could we do to create like better relationships between like Israel and Palestine or like whoever you want. And then if you can't think of anything like clever that you think, or even not clever that you think would be a cool idea, then maybe Google some stuff and see what other people are talking about. So all of these things, the goal of this, and especially the list that you wrote at the beginning, the idea of these is to kind of pick your brain for different things that you can do, or different things that are being done out in the world or that could be done that could make things better. Because that's really what you're trying to do with your case, is you're trying to construct a slightly better world, right? Not like an infinitely better world, because again, that creates like cases that aren't really fair. But you want to create a world that is better than the one that we currently live in, or at least that you think would be better than we currently live in. That's kind of the generic thing for most cases. That being said, there are some variations. So all of what I've talked about, like just so far, is about the present tense. But you can also do different cases where you're put in like in the shoes of a certain actor. So these are called time-space cases, where you or not even in the shoes of an actor necessarily, but you're in a different place, like in time and space. So let's say you're deciding whether to like drop nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's fine. Like that's totally cool. And when you create a case like that, you want to make sure that so the rules of time-space cases, like vaguely speaking, are that you can't rely on knowledge that was gained after that time period. So if you're debating about whether or not in a time-space kind of setting you should be dropping those like nuclear bombs, then you can't rely on like what happened afterwards or like the way that the Japanese state has like turned out in the 21st century. Like those are not applicable, and you can't rely on that knowledge. You're supposed to use the knowledge that was available to the people at the time. And so that's like a cool way that you can also generate different ideas. Like if you think, that if you're interested in a particular period of history or like a specific person that you think is cool, then you can create like a time-space case for that. That's like one of the variations on generic kind of cases. The other one is called op-choice cases, where instead of choosing the thing that you want to change, you could choose anything that is debatable. I think, like someone will correct me, I'm sure, but I think you don't even have to change something. Like you could debate something that's already happening if it's in an op-choice framework. So op-choice, op is the other team, choice means they choose. So op-choice means that the other team gets a chance to choose what side they have. So even if it's let's say, what was the example before, like dropping the nuclear bombs, which is probably not a great example, so don't use that. But you could say op-choice, like should the U.S. have dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Then the other side can choose whether they want to drop the bomb or not drop the bomb. So that's totally cool, and maybe that is a good case. Like you choose your own adventure here. So. Anyway, you allow the op to choose, and because you're doing that, I think you also don't have to change something about the status quo necessarily. Like maybe, maybe you could debate, like, should we have Medicaid? Like to use my example from before, and then op choice, because then you don't have to change something. I think the reason, just out of my own like personal opinion / what I've heard, is that the reason that you have to change something is because that puts like a higher burden on the government team, which is as it's supposed to be. You're proposing a change of something that's not happening in the real world, and it's your responsibility to come up with what that change should be, and then defend why we shouldn't keep the status quo. And then it's the op's job, usually, to defend the status quo or some variant on the status quo through counter casing and stuff that you should also look up or talk to someone if you don't know what that is, because it's not in the purview of this video. So this is the general stuff of like what are types of cases and how to come up with your first one. The last one that I think I missed is like actor cases, where it's like you are a specific person. Like you are like Kennedy. What do you do in this particular situation? Then oftentimes, I'm not sure of exactly what the rules here are or like what the standards are, and I think they're constantly changing, but the basic idea is often when you're like, or like you are the president of China, like do you liberalize? Then the analysis in that case, that's called an actor analysis, you should be relying on what is valuable and what is important to that specific actor. So as the president of China, you probably like China, for example. And then your arguments should derive from the values that you have as an actor, even if those aren't like generic values that everyone happens to have. That's the first part of the video. The second half of this video, we'll talk about how to actually write your case, which is important. So the first thing that you have to be able to define is what your case statement is. So a case statement is pretty much where you give a tiny bit of like general context for this. So if for example, you're going to talk about some of the protest movements that have been happening in South Africa, then that's fine. Just give a little bit of context, because presumably like people won't have a lot of knowledge about that, although they should. They're quite interesting. But you would give a little bit of context, like the fees must fall movement started in South Africa at this university and has spread to these universities and around the world, and we're debating about whether or not fees must fall is good, or like this house regrets fees must fall. So your case statement provides a tiny bit of context if needed. If it's just like this house would ban abortion, then that's fine. Like I don't think you need a ton of context for that, although you should be more specific, which we'll talk about in a second. But for the basic case statement, the way that this works is, for some reason, we're talking about a house. So it's like the House of Parliament. So you would say, this house believes, which is a motion where you debate about what you value. So like, this house believes that children should be able to, children shouldn't have to do homework, whatever. Like, it's something that you're debating about whether or not that thing, should be true. So this house believes means the proposition team, the government, I guess the gov team, says that they believe, and then the op team disagrees with that. Or you can also just do this house would, where you institute a policy, like this house would impose like a curfew on everyone in America. Like these are terrible ideas intentionally, so that you don't steal them and that you're really using your own stuff. But like this house would impose a curfew on everyone in America. Then you have to propose a policy for who's going to impose that and how they would do that, which we'll talk about momentarily. So this house believes, this house would, this house regrets. Those sorts of things. There are some other variations on this, but those are, I think, the biggest ones. So that's how you create your case statement. Have an actual statement that is to be debated. Don't have it be a question. Some people do this by accident, where it's like, should we legalize marijuana? Not a good case statement. The case statement should be, this house believes that we should legalize marijuana, because then it's very clear what the government team is defending and what the opposition team is defending, as opposed to just like vaguely like this question that's kind of hanging out there. So that's the case statement. Second thing here is your policy. So especially in this house would debates, you do want to define a policy. And then in other kinds of debates, sometimes you want to explain like who we're talking about and that sort of stuff. But specifically for policy motions, like this house would impose a higher income tax. You'd be like, how much higher? And things like that. You want to be specific about what exactly you're going to be doing. Or else like who knows what's going to happen? Like if you're going to impose a curfew, who's going to enforce that curfew? How are they going to enforce it? Is it like penalty of death if you're back home after 9 o'clock? Like what happens in this world? Give a really clear picture of what it looks like, and paint that for what, so that the other team and the judge and your partner, hopefully, understand exactly what's being debated about. So you've got the case statement, and then you've got some kind of a policy, usually, or specifics. And then we're down to like actually writing your case. So, the last thing about your policy, I would say just clarify it as much as is reasonable. Like, you don't have to say exactly the percentage or the number of, like, years in prison you'll get if you break the curfew. I don't know, maybe you should. Like, I think that might actually be an example of a reasonable clarification. But You don't have to say like which municipalities will be in charge of this in different states, and so that's like totally unreasonable. So don't worry about that. But if people ask specific questions, then you could have things in mind. So the next thing, now that we've covered the first part, is to actually like write your case, and this is the fun part. Hopefully, or like hopefully this is all the fun part. This video has just been a joyride for you, I'm sure. So the way that you write your case is as follows. The first thing that you want to do is come up with, well, there's two ways to do this. If you think that you can come up with 3 arguments, like 3 reasons why your side of the topic is correct, or why we should do something, or why we should, like, why we believe this thing, come up with 3 reasons for that. Then cool, like do that. If you can't, like right off the bat, be like, like let's say this curfew motion that's like very, very strange. Then your 3 reasons could be like, 1, like people will get more sleep. Like we should have a curfew because people will get more sleep. Could be one argument, and then another one could be like we should have a curfew because then there will be less crime because we'll know that everyone out on the street after a certain time is a criminal, so we can just arrest them or whatever. And then the third reason would be like. The police, like, I don't know, maybe we employ more police officers, or like people to like watch people at night. Well, yeah, whatever it is. These are 3 reasons that are vaguely plausible for why this motion should be true. So those would be my 3 arguments. If you can't do that right off the bat, then that's like totally cool. Well, I would say before you go and like dig into research, I would just get out a literally blank sheet of paper and just write down everything you can think of. Good or bad about this motion, or things that you think, or just like people that you think will be affected by this, or anything that you think would be affected, like the crime rate, or whatever. Write all of those things down on a piece of paper. Just like dump your whole brain about this topic, or examples that are related to this, or examples that aren't related to this, whatever. Just get it on paper, and then after that, you can start thinking, okay, what could I use? What could I argue to defend this motion? And then from there, you can come up with your 3 arguments, hopefully. The 3 arguments are like 3 different being the key word, reasons why the motion should be true. So if I had one argument that was like people will get more sleep, and another argument about how people will be more well-rested, those are not good. That's not a good thing, because those are very, very similar. Rather, you want to have different things. Different arguments, and maybe sometimes they'll focus on different people. So if you're saying like we should send ground troops to Syria, like maybe you could have a point about how like this will help the Kurds, and another point about how like this will defeat ISIS, right? Like affecting different groups, and that's a cool thing. But anyway, there's many, many ways to come up with these arguments. But the big thing is think about what feels true to you, like what makes you believe that this motion should be adopted, because hopefully you do believe that it should be adopted. But not so strongly that it's a tight case. But anyway, like you believe that there are reasons against it, but overall, like you think it's like pretty true. So then you've got these 3 arguments that you have to support it. So from those, what I would do next is take out a clean sheet of paper, or if you're going to do it on a computer, like that's cool too, and write down those things. But try to keep your these are called taglines, extremely short. So like they're like the headings of the argument. So if my argument was people will be better rested, you don't have to write down, or people get more sleep, I guess. You don't have to write down like we should have a curfew because people will get more sleep. You can just write like more sleep. Like try to cut it down to 3, like 2, somewhere between 1 and 4 words for your tagline, just because it makes your life easier. And also your judge's life easier, so that they can write this down more effectively, and your opponents, you want to make sure everyone knows what your arguments are. If they don't, your life is unpleasant for the rest of that round. So write down the key topic, the key tagline of your argument. That's the first thing that you want to do. Then after that, then we want to move on to how to construct the arguments within those. And the cautionary note that I'll make here is that I strongly, strongly recommend against writing out your case word for word. Your case is not like a State of the Union address. You don't have a teleprompter. You want to, the way that you can deliver a speech most persuasively. Like if I was reading this entire video from you word for word, then I would probably not be listened to at all, and you would immediately fall asleep and then go do something else. Don't do that. Like, don't put yourself in a position where you could read the case just word for word. Rather, have come up with shorter ways to say the same things. Or things that will jog your memory. So think about it the same way when you flow, like hopefully someone's given you this advice or will give you this advice. When you're trying to write down arguments from the case, from a debate, you don't want to write down word for word what they're saying. You want to write down the key words or ideas that will signal to future you what happened at that time. And similarly here, you want to signal to future you what you're going to talk about. So that's like the cautionary note about all of this. But the way that you actually structure each individual argument, and this is really, really important. There's a basic framework that I'm going to lay out for you right now, and it's so effective that it can pretty much always work for you. There's 3 parts to this framework. They're called claim, warrant, and impact. Claim is what you're arguing. So after you've got these 2 words, like more sleep, you can write a claim, which is like, the what you're saying. It usually links the topic that you're talking about to the impact, which we'll talk about later. But the basic idea here is like having a curfew in place will encourage people to get more sleep. Like that's your claim in this argument. That's what you are arguing here. So that's claim is what you're arguing. The next thing is a warrant, or many warrants, hopefully, which are why it's true. So here you're trying to prove why it's true that having a curfew will encourage people to get more sleep. And then the third thing is impact. Impact being why it matters. So I'm going to spend a little more time on the second 2. So further talking about warrants, there's 1.5 million ways to come up with warrants for something. So don't just stick to the easiest thing or have one warrant for something. Warrants, I think, are the most interesting part of debating, and you should put emphasis on them commensurate to that. So what I would recommend is having many ways that you can justify this argument or justify that this thing is true. So the way that you can do that is think about justifying it from many different perspectives, or using many sources of common knowledge, not sources of like a Pew poll found, because that's not really allowed here. It's called specific knowledge. But what you do want to do is have things that are just things that everybody knows. So, for example, you can just to run through kind of an informal list of warrants that come to mind easily to me right now. One of them is you can use common knowledge. So just if you know that when you go home before 9, you're asleep before 10, or if for some reason that was very commonly known, then you could use that, something that everybody knows, or if everybody knows that there's a civil war happening in Syria, or everybody should know. If it's something that could pop up on the front page of the New York Times, or that has, or theoretically ought pop up on the front page of the New York Times, then that's cool. That's fine. Just use. Then you can rely on that common knowledge. The more basic one is probably a chain of logic. So you just explain how this happens step by step. So when you go home, you are your life is more boring because you're only exposed to the things that are actually in your house. And then when you're more bored, you're likely to get more sleepy. And then when you're more sleepy, you're more likely to sleep. So you can use the things that are like a chain of logic to explain your argument. That's a very compelling way to have a warrant. Another way is to have probably the third thing I'd say is a historical example. So if you know that some big war happened or some policy was implemented somewhere in the past and it had this effect, then that's cool. You can use that. Similarly, then I'd say fourth is a current example, just an example that's happening in the world right now. So if you're saying that people should revolt against oppressive governments, you could be are there any examples of countries that have recently revolted against their governments, and how are those countries doing? How can we gauge how likely countries are to succeed or write cool constitutions and stuff after they revolt against crappy governments? All of those are super legit. And then, all right, so I'm blanking now on what the other types of warrants are, but pretty much whatever you can use to prove that something is true is good enough. And so warrants, you should have lots of them to defend each argument. But when you're writing those, don't write out the whole story about how the Arab Spring is happening and Egypt had a revolution, Tunisia had a revolution, Iran tried to have a revolution, all that stuff. Just write down the names of those countries. For example, maybe you'd write down Arab Spring and then be Egypt, Tunisia, etc. And then when you get up there to speak, you would be able to look down and be like, and you'd see that, and you'd be like, all right, Egypt, like, all right, here I'm going to talk about how it's going in Egypt post the revolution, and then you'd explain that. So you don't have to write out don't write word for word, but you don't even necessarily have to write like the super explicit examples or super explicit explanations for things. If you think the example will jog your memory, then that's totally good enough. So don't worry about being like overly specific there. So that's warrants. I think I've covered that like okay. And then impacts is the next thing, which is why it's true. And the way that you prove, oh, sorry, no. Whoops. Impacts are why it matters. So here you're going to talk about why it matters that people get more sleep. Like, who cares? Like, so sure, you've proven that this curfew will encourage people to get more sleep, but why does it matter that people are going to get more sleep? And don't stop at like, okay, well, they'll be like more productive or whatever. Like, come up with clever ways. Or not clever, but like after you've asked why does it matter, ask why does it matter again. So, pardon me, you said people get more sleep, so people are less tired. Okay, why does it matter that people are less tired? It matters because they'll like do better at work. Why does it matter that they'll do better at work? Because they will like contribute to a productive economy. Like, why does it matter that people will contribute to a productive economy? Because then the living standards of people in the country or in their company or whatever will get higher, and then keep going down this chain until it's absurd. So it's a really good way, especially early on, to think about like why does this actually matter? Because in debating, it's not enough to say like 100 people died, because technically there's no intrinsic value for or against like the deaths of people, right? Like, you need to explain why it's bad for people to die. So like, people lose family members, like many people get extremely sad, and like, you know, there's lots of reasons that you can come up with, because I think it's probably true, but it's not enough to just say it. And same thing like goes even more so with money. Like, all right, like, we'll save more money, or like, we'll make more money. Like, okay, who cares? Like, what is the value of money? You have to be able to come up with a way to convince the judge that that is valuable. So whether that's like the emotive power of like, you know, the people that you can convince them that matter, or you can logically speak through what the many faceted impacts are, all of which are valuable and you know, we agree are important. So that's cool. Like, that's how you impact stuff, and have many impacts to things, and show how they affect many different groups. Like, it's pretty boring to say, like, let's say I work with high school debaters, and so these topics are all terrible. But like, let's say like banning school uniforms. If you're trying to say that kids will do better in school, you're trying to impact this. It's not enough to just be like, oh, like they'll do better in school. You also want to come up with thoughtful ways that it'll affect different groups of people. So not just like kids will do better in school, but like, how does this affect different kids differently? So if there's like super high achieving kids, then they'll be able to like go and do like amazing work. And if it's affecting low achieving kids, then maybe they're less likely to drop out. You know, it affects different groups differently, and it can be really helpful for you to nuance your impacts on that metric. And likewise, you can subdivide those groups. So like, there's like high performing low income students. Like, how are they affected by this differently? And then there's like there's an infinite number of cross sections of different, like, whether it's like religions or races or classes or like nationalities or like gender identities, like whatever you want to go with, that's cool. And don't take it to the to the extreme, but do think concretely about the major groups that this affects differently, because that'll also help you generate new arguments and ideas for the way that this will affect people in the real world. So that's really important. So now that we've gone through kind of claim, warrant, impact, I'll give you one other. I'll extend on that first. I'll say the way that is modified later on. So the way that I like to modify it is to add on, after claim, warrant, impact, two things, which are an example and a comparison. So an example, you just like, after you've illustrated this, you can walk through an example, whether it's, and these also could be warrants, but like a personal example or like a hypothetical example or whatever, and just explain, or like a historical example. You know, these things are also warrants, but just make sure like if you have this in your mind as like claim, warrant, impact, example, comparison, then you'll always remember to have an example, which is really important because it just helps contextualize it and make it feel real to yourself and everyone else in the debate. And then the comparison thing is also important. And what this is you compare it to what's happening in the other world. So without the curfew, what would be happening? And explain why that's bad. In like an explicit comparison that paints a picture of their world where it's easily contrasted against your world. So those things are important. And that's a way to extend this if you want to get more material into your case. So the second way that, I don't know, well, all right, I'm just going to throw this out there, and if it's useful for you or like useful for you to think about, then that's cool. If it's not, then whatever. I don't really care. So the first one is, well, actually, so this method of making arguments is as follows. First part of the argument is what's happening now. So, for example, if you're going to like get rid of the veto power of the UN Security Council, you could be like, what's happening now? People are using the veto to stop important like UN initiatives and stuff like that. Like, cool, all right, that's fine. And then what changes? Okay, what changes is that people can't veto anymore, and and specifically like these countries will no longer be able to have veto power. And then what is the good or bad impact of this change? So what's happening now within each argument? And you can do this for the sleep one too, right? Like, what's happening now? Like, people aren't getting enough sleep. What changes? People will be forced to stay at home. Why is that good or bad? Well, it's good because people will go home and then they'll go to sleep earlier, and that'll be really important. And within this last part, within the why is this good or bad, you should also have lots of warrants and impacts. So these strategies overlap. But anyway, whatever works for you, just make sure that you're proving your argument that it's true, and you're proving that it matters. Because if you don't do one of those things, then your argument is totally like worthless in the round, effectively. Because if you didn't show that it's important, then why should we be listening to it at all? And if you didn't show that it's true, then like we shouldn't believe you, and therefore your argument carries no weight. It carries no weight. It can carry no weight either way. Just make sure that you have both of those things, and you've done that effectively. So that's the basics of how to actually construct the argument. I think so. There's a few more things. One resource that's available to you is aptaweb.org, or specifically for novices, it's novices.aptaweb.org. So go on there, and you can find a better explanation written out for how you should write your first case, and then also you should. So that's like one of the resources, and then also your varsity members, or like email the novice mentors, whose email I think I have right here. Nope, I don't have it, but it's on the website. So just like go to that, go to novices.aptaweb.org, and you'll find it. So yeah, that's like general resources, and then a cautionary note would be to if you haven't heard what spec is yet. Spec is a shorthand for specific knowledge, which you're not supposed to use, and it's not supposed to be a part of the debate, really. Like, that's why I mentioned the front page of the New York Times standard, or like some people use the like well-read college student. But you shouldn't be debating about like what kind of jet fuel should the U.S. Air Force use, where the differences between different types of jet fuel are so technical that we don't have access to that knowledge, and shouldn't be expected to have access to that knowledge. So that's like don't write cases that are spec. And then also don't include stuff that's spec. The best advice that I got when I first started debating at college was to just don't use statistics. Like, you can say, you can reference things that are generally like known to be true, like like more than half of Americans, or like the majority of Americans don't save much money, or whatever, or like take out a big mortgage to buy their house. Like, whatever, you can rely on stuff like that, but don't be like 73% of Americans don't do this thing, or like should do this thing. Whatever, like that's not important to me, or you, or the judge, because, and if you think about it, like those kinds of facts, facts in air quotes, that's a little scary, but those facts are not valuable in the debate, partly because, for the same reason I talked about before with impacts. Like, it doesn't matter that 100 people would die from having this oil spill, unless you explain and contextualize why that's important. It also similarly doesn't prove that it's true unless you can prove a reason for why that's true. So if if you're trying to make an argument about why like construction should be banned, I don't know, this is weird, but like you wouldn't just say like 53 people die on construction sites like every time you build a big building, because that's not like valid necessarily unless you articulate to us why that's true, and can show like a causal relationship between those things. So don't use spec in general, and then especially like don't like rely on it in the course of the debate, or like at all. The second thing is if you're going to talk about like really sensitive matter in the debate, or if the whole topic is based on something like that could potentially be triggering to someone, whether this is eating disorders or abuse or suicide, make sure that you provide a trigger warning ahead of time. At the top of the case, even before the case statement, be like, this case is going to deal with issues of X, and then be like, if anybody like has a problem with that, or hopefully talk about this with them before the round. But at the very least, just provide a warning, like this is going to be discussed in this case, and if anyone like strongly objects to this, then we can like discuss like running a new case or something like that. Because you want to create an inclusive atmosphere on the debating circuit, because it's not super fun and for anyone to debate about things that are deeply personal to them and are like traumatizing or whatever. So just be sensitive about that stuff and be nice to people, because that's like a good thing to do. And then another cautionary note is avoid the status quo. Like for cases, if you want to implement this policy but it's already implemented, then don't do that, or make it an op choice case. But avoid like if you find out in the middle of a round that like your case is actually status quo, it's not a fun time because then like theoretically I think you lose the debate or whatever. It's just like it's not a good deal, so don't do that. And then tautologies, like things that are true or are like demonstrably true, like 2 + 2 is 4. Probably not a great debate topic. Or like like the sun is this big, like not interesting, or particularly like debatable. And then another cautionary note about content, just like don't generalize about whole groups of people. It's usually not true or persuasive or like cool. So just don't do it because it's not going to help you or anybody else. And then I'd say the last thing, I'll have like, for people that have watched the whole thing, you get some sneak peeks at things for advanced case writing that are interesting, that you can also do right now. The first one I'll throw in quickly is creating burdens. So early in your case, you can write about like, early in the case, you want to indicate what the other team would have to do to win. And then you can phrase this not as like they have to do this to win, but like they have to do this in order to even be in contention for like competing in this debate. One, they're going to have to prove that this won't help the most marginalized group in society, and two, they're going to have to prove that the U.S. government won't like waste a bunch of money trying to patch up an alternative or something like that. Whatever it is, like come up with what they might have to do in order to win the debate, because that can create like clear things that have to happen, and it makes the judge's life way easier. Because you don't want to leave the judge with just a bunch of things, like here's some arguments, here's some impacts, and then nothing to do with them. Second thing that also relates to that can also go at the very beginning of your case, after your case statement, like before you jump into your arguments, you can include some burdens, and you can also start weighing. So the way weighing works is you're comparing different things. So at the end of the debate, the most common thing that, happens to novices or anybody, I think, in debating, is that they leave the judge with these impacts. So like here is like 100 lives are saved, or like $1 million are saved, or like people will feel more comfortable. Like those are things, but there's no way to compare them against each other, or like liberty and security. Like how does the judge do anything with that? And the answer is that they do whatever they feel like, which is not good for you. You want to assume the judge is an idiot. Hopefully they're not, but like assume that they are and do all that work for them. So the way that weighing works is that you're comparing two impacts. And the easiest, the kind of cornerstones of weighing are probability and magnitude. So if one impact is much more probable than another, it should carry more weight in the round. If another impact has a bigger magnitude, like it affects more people or it affects the people more, then that has more weight in the round. And so you can compare probability and magnitude as well as many other metrics for which to weigh things. But just think about that, and think about how another easy kind of off the cuff way to weigh is to think about if things are prerequisites. So like you can get off in a lot of rounds with just saying like we're trying to save lives and they're trying to save or like give people more of a right to education. But because you need to be alive to have an education, you should prioritize this one, lives, above education. It's like a prerequisite to that argument, and therefore it's more important. And there's a bunch of other ways, but you should just be consciously thinking about this and then put those things in at the beginning of the case. The two ones that I like the most, that I think are really interesting, are or like that are just kind of easy to teach and easy to use are long-term versus short-term. So let's say your case, it's like you're making some environmental regulation. It might have some short-term costs to the economy or whatever, but will have huge long-term benefits. You can say the long-term should always be valued more than the short-term because in the long-term, like in the short-term, the most impact that any policy could possibly have on like human beings is, at like 7 billion people. But in the long term, like those people are going to have kids and then more kids and more kids. So it can affect many generations of people, or even within one country, right? So in the long term, more people are affected. So for those of you following at home, that makes your argument have more magnitude because it affects more people. And so you can say at the beginning, at the top of case, like long-term impacts are always going to be valued above short-term impacts. Or conversely, you could say short-term impacts should always be valued over long-term impacts because just like you can predict the weather more accurately 2 days from now than like 2 years from now, short-term impacts, there are less variables that are involved, and so we can predict it more accurately. And so therefore, we should value the short-term impacts above long-term impacts at every point in this round. So anyway, that's a valuable way that you can weigh, which is going to be important for you for winning debates. So make sure that you do those things, especially at the beginning of your case. It'd be really cool to do. And again, like just practicing this and practicing like writing crappy cases or like scribbling them out in your notebook or like on your phone, with like 3 arguments and then like tiny subpoints or like sub-arguments or whatever. That's totally cool. Like do that as much as you can because it'll make you a better debater and it'll make you a better case writer and it'll make your life more fun on APTA because you don't want to just be the person that runs the same 2 cases or the same case, which like many of us, myself included, have been, like were for a long time. You just don't want to do that because it's not fun for you and it's not fun for your opponents and it also like will have competitive detriment to you. So these things are important, I think. And if you think other things are important, that's cool. Then do those things differently, or talk to varsity members, or talk to other novices. But the big takeaways here are like, think about stuff that you like, because you'll have more fun debating about it, and then be careful about structuring it. So just like, think concretely about making sure that you've proven the important stuff. And then lastly, like just write, because it'll make you a better everything, as I just talked about. Hopefully you found this helpful, and if you have more questions, you can get me on my email at mattsummers123@gmail.com, which is my name, and then 123@gmail.com. Yeah, cool. All right, enjoy, and good luck writing your first case. It'll be fun. Or not fun, but that's fine anyway.